When my son told me to sign over everything, or stay away from his wedding, I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I brought someone who could speak louder than threats, my lawyer. What happened that night at Franco's wasn't just about money. It was about dignity and the quiet power of a mother who'd had enough. If you've ever been pushed to the edge by your own child, stay with me. This story is for you. The burgundy dress still hung at the far end of my closet. I hadn't touched it in almost 3 years, but I knew exactly where it was. Pressed, dry-cleaned, and layered in a thin sheath of plastic like a museum artifact. It wasn't particularly fashionable, not anymore, but it had history. I wore it when Tyler finished college when he turned 30, and once more when he brought home the promotion letter he was so proud of. Each of those nights I remember him looking at me with eyes full of pride and gratitude. "You look lovely, Mom," he used to say. "That color suits you." I used to believe it did. Now, as I stood in front of the mirror smoothing that same fabric across my 62-year-old frame, I wondered if the woman in the reflection was still someone he recognized. Or worse, if she was now just an obstacle between him and whatever life he thought he deserved. I'm Linda Carraway. For 3 decades, I balanced spreadsheets and lunch receipts at a small accounting office just outside Hendersonville. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was steady. After my husband died suddenly of a stroke 12 years ago, that job and my son were the only constants I had left. Tyler was only 23 then, still living at home, still raw from the loss of his father. I remember how he'd sit at the kitchen table at midnight going over job listings with me, asking for advice, sometimes not saying anything at all. We grew close in those years. Not just mother and son, but allies trying to make sense of the world without the man we both loved. But things change, especially when money gets involved, especially when people fall in love with someone who doesn't know your sacrifices, only your savings account. Tyler's 35 now. Handsome, driven, well-dressed. He works in commercial real estate, closing deals over lunch at high-rise bistros I've never stepped foot in. And he's engaged to Mara, 28, with perfect teeth and an Instagram full of soft-filtered travel photos and outfit reels. She's the kind of woman who uses the word aesthetic to describe cutlery and whose idea of a wedding includes a horse-drawn carriage and imported orchids. I didn't judge her. I didn't have to. Because Tyler had already started changing long before she entered the picture. In the past 2 years, our phone calls shortened, our Sunday brunches faded into memory. He started talking to me like I was an inconvenience, like any opinion I offered came from a place of ignorance. The last time we met, 6 weeks ago, he didn't even ask how I'd been. He came straight to the point. "I need you to help with the wedding," he said casually, like someone requesting a refill on water. "We're putting together the final numbers and we need about 75 grand from you." I blinked. 75,000. His tone hardened. "It's not that much considering what you've got saved. That what you've got saved was what remained of my retirement nest egg. Built slowly over 4 decades, bolstered by the life insurance policy from my late husband, and guarded carefully ever since. After selling our old home, too big for me alone. I downsized to a 2-bedroom on the quiet side of town. I clipped coupons, negotiated bills, and made peace with casseroles twice a week. It wasn't just money. It was security. It was dignity. It was everything I'd planned to carry me into old age without becoming a burden to anyone, especially him. "I can give you 15,000, I said after a long pause. "That's more than enough for a beautiful, meaningful celebration." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't about paper plates and church halls. This is Mara's dream. We're building a future. You're either with us or in the way." I didn't respond. I couldn't. Not with my heart twisting in my chest like a wrung towel. He didn't ask. He demanded. And when I didn't give him what he wanted, he called me selfish. Selfish. After all those years of missed vacations, of choosing hand-me-downs over department stores, of working Saturdays, just to make sure his field trips and soccer camps were never out of reach, I bit my lip, nodded politely, and left that cafe before the tears could show. The weeks that followed were silent. No calls, no updates. Just me and the tiny garden I tended behind the duplex. Tomatoes, herbs, the single rosebush that always bloomed too early. I tried to believe that maybe it was just the stress of planning or Mara's influence or something that would pass. But deep down, I knew. Tyler wasn't confused. He was calculating, and I was now just a line item on his wedding spreadsheet. Then came the text. A simple one. Dinner next Thursday. Let's talk again. My treat. Tyler. I stared at it for a long time. Was this an olive branch? A second chance, I told myself it was. That maybe the silence had been good for him. That maybe he'd taken a step back and remembered the woman who'd always stood behind him, even when he forgot to turn around. And that's why I pulled the dress from the closet. I ironed it that morning, lit a candle in the living room, and sat for nearly 10 minutes, staring at the only framed photo I still kept of our old family, me, Tyler, and Frank, on the porch of the house we'd sold. I whispered something only the silence could hear. Then I stood up, zipped the dress, and stepped into the shoes I hadn't worn since the last time he looked at me with pride. I wanted to believe this dinner was about healing, that it would be two people meeting in the middle, a mother and son finding their way back. I hadn't yet learned that sometimes invitations come not from love, but from strategy. I hadn't yet learned that the person I raised might be the one I'd have to protect myself from. And still I showed up. Because that's what mothers do, even when it might be the last time. Franco's hadn't changed much in 20 years. The same warm brick exterior still covered with ivy. The same soft golden lights that spilled onto the sidewalk like quiet laughter. I hadn't been there since our 30th anniversary. Frank had surprised me with dinner reservations and a single gardenia tucked behind my ear. That memory lingered like perfume, delicate and impossible to grasp. I arrived right on time. 6:30 sharp. I've always believed in punctuality, not just as courtesy but as dignity. When I told the hostess I had a reservation under Carraway, she smiled kindly and led me through the dining room. I expected to see Tyler waiting, maybe sipping water, maybe fiddling with his phone like he used to when he was nervous. Instead, I saw Mara. She stood when I approached, her designer dress sleek and satiny, too glamorous for a weeknight dinner, but just right for the message it sent. We're serious. We have power. Her makeup was flawless, her expression unreadable, and flanking her were 3 men in suits, none of whom I recognized. The table was already set. 5 place settings, white wine chilling in a bucket, leather folios stacked neatly between the breadbasket and the salt. I slowed my steps. Something shifted in my stomach, not quite dread, but something adjacent. Mara extended her hand like a politician, poised, rehearsed. "Linda, thank you for coming," she said with a smile that didn't touch her eyes. I sat slowly. My voice came out softer than I wanted. "Where's Tyler?" "He's just finishing up a call. He'll be here any minute." One of the suited men leaned forward. "Mrs. Carraway, it's a pleasure. I'm Stephen Marks. These are my colleagues Patrick and Elias. We're associates of Tyler's." I nodded politely, but my mind scrambled for footing. Associates of what kind? These weren't wedding planners, and this certainly wasn't dinner, when Tyler finally arrived. Jacket over his arm hair perfectly in place. He looked every inch the polished professional. He kissed Mara on the cheek, like a man clocking into a shift, then turned to me. "Hey, Mom. Thanks for coming." He sat down across from me and glanced at the documents. "Let's get started." I didn't touch the menu. "Started with what?" He gestured towards Stephen. "They've prepared the papers for you to review. It's really very straightforward." Still, I sat hands folded tightly in my lap. "Tyler, what papers?" He met my eyes for the first time that evening. "A power of attorney. To help us help you, Mom. We just want to make sure your affairs are in order. That everything's being handled responsibly. Handled by whom? By us." Mara said, her tone flat. We've spoken to a financial advisor. There's a lot that can be optimized if we move quickly. And let's face it, Linda. Managing property accounts tax issues at your age can get overwhelming. I felt the words like a low blow to the ribs. Overwhelming. At my age, I'd managed every tax return, every utility bill, every mortgage renewal for decades. I kept my books balanced to the cent. I knew every line item in my modest investment portfolio and clipped coupons like it was an Olympic sport. I looked to my son again. What if I say no? The silence that followed felt like a shift in temperature. Mara didn't even blink. Then you probably shouldn't come to the wedding. I stared at her, and she continued, her voice smooth as silk stretched over a blade you should not expect to be part of our child's life. It's really your decision, Linda. But actions have consequences. My breath caught in my throat. That child, my grandchild, still unborn, still forming fingers and eyelashes inside Mara's curated womb, had already become a tool for leverage, a pawn in their game. I felt something break. Not loudly, not like a shattered glass, but quietly deep beneath the ribs, like a fiber giving out after being stretched too far, too long. Still, I didn't cry. Not here, not in front of these people. Instead, I straightened in my seat, reaching slowly into my purse, past the folded napkin, past my old wallet, past the backup lip balm I'd carried for years. My fingers found my phone. I didn't speak yet, just scrolled to the name I'd saved under just in case. Tyler noticed. Mom, there's no need to overreact. We're just trying to make things smoother for everyone. I looked up. There's someone who wants to say a few words. His eyes narrowed. What does that mean? But I was already pressing the call button. 1 ring, 2, then, "Hi, it's me," I said as calm as I'd ever sounded. "Could you come to Franco's?" "Yes, now. I think it's time." I ended the call and placed the phone gently beside the untouched wine glass. The table went still. Mara's mouth twitched. Maybe confusion, maybe irritation. Tyler spoke again, this time with a hint of warning. "What are you doing, Mom?" I turned my gaze to the man who used to bring me orange juice when I was sick. The boy who once whispered he didn't want to grow up too fast because he liked living at home with me. And I said quietly, "Leveling the field." The restaurant door opened with a small chime. I turned just as he stepped inside. Ethan, my younger son, 32, still in his scrubs badge clipped to his pocket, hospital sneakers, carrying a trail of night shift exhaustion behind him. His dark hair was mussed, probably from running a hand through it too many times, and his eyes were scanning the room with that quiet alertness I'd come to recognize as his emergency mode gaze. He spotted me and walked over, pausing just long enough to nod at the people seated at the table before gently touching my shoulder. "Mom," he said, calm and low. "You called." I nodded, swallowing a lump I hadn't realized was there. I did. "Let's talk." He looked around, then gestured to an empty booth a few feet away. Just us for a moment. Tyler opened his mouth to object, but Ethan raised one hand. Firm, controlled. "Give us a minute." He didn't wait for approval. I followed him, my legs stiff, the sounds of clinking glasses and background jazz fading under the weight of everything that had just happened. Once we were seated, Ethan took the manila folder from under my arm. "What is this?" he asked, flipping it open. "They want me to sign power of attorney. Give them full control over my finances, house insurance, everything." His jaw tensed as he scanned the pages. His eyes flicked back and forth rapidly, absorbing the language the way he probably read medical charts. Efficient, precise, focused. After a minute, he closed it and set it gently on the table. "This isn't assistance," he said. "It's coercion." I looked down. "They said if I don't sign, I'm out of the wedding. Out of the baby's life." He leaned forward. "Mom, that is not legal. That is manipulation. I nodded slowly, not because I didn't believe him, but because hearing it aloud made it more real, more damning, more painful. Ethan ran a hand through his hair. Did you tell them no? Not yet. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't expecting lawyers at dinner. He exhaled and looked toward their table. They planned this. It's too choreographed. When we returned, the mood had shifted. Tyler was tapping his glass impatiently. Mara sat with her arms crossed. The three men in suits had the look of executives trying to manage a PR crisis. Ethan didn't sit. He stood beside me and addressed the table calmly. My mother asked me to look over these documents. I'm a licensed physician, not a lawyer, but I know predatory behavior when I see it. Patrick. One of the attorneys gave a tight smile. We understand your concern, but given your mother's age and her recent inconsistencies, this is simply a safety measure. There's been some concern about cognitive clarity. I blinked. What? Stephen leaned forward. We've received informal reports, missed payments, repetitive questions, difficulty managing home repairs. Ethan barked a laugh, sharp and without warmth. Are you kidding me? This is the woman who raised 2 sons after her husband died, balanced budgets down to the penny and taught me how to refinance my first car loan. She clipped coupons for 20 years and negotiated her own property taxes last spring. His voice rose just slightly, the steel behind it unmistakable. This is the woman who taught me the difference between wants and needs, who helped me get through med school without a dime of debt. He looked at them all, then settled on his brother. And now you're telling me she's suddenly too confused to handle her own life. Tyler bristled. Don't be dramatic. We're trying to make things easier, for whom Ethan shot back. You and your new lifestyle, Mara's influencer dreams, or the baby you're already using as leverage. Mara's mouth tightened into a hard line. This isn't about you, Ethan. No, he said, his voice steady. It's about Mom, and your attempt to gaslight her into handing over everything she's worked for. The youngest lawyer, Elias, looked increasingly uncomfortable. He adjusted his tie and glanced toward Stephen, who offered nothing but a forced smile. I sat there stunned, not by the accusations, but by the realization that Ethan saw it all, clearly, that I wasn't overreacting, that I wasn't being overly emotional or paranoid. I had been right to feel the knot in my chest, the unease in my gut. Tyler shook his head. She's not thinking long-term. She sold the house, downsized. Doesn't that tell you something? Ethan nodded. It tells me she made a responsible financial decision after losing her husband. One I fully supported, by the way. He looked at me. You're not alone, Mom. Not now. Not ever. That was when I realized the shift, the awakening. The part of the story where something inside me began to reassemble. Not into the mother who always gave in, who always made peace, but into someone new. Someone who had backup. Someone who had boundaries. Ethan turned back to the group. If anyone here attempts to pressure my mother into signing anything tonight, I will personally escort her out and we will involve her actual attorney. Tyler leaned forward, the mask finally slipping. You don't get it. You've always been Mom's favorite. You didn't see the stress, the bills, the worry. We need this. Ethan stared at him. No, Tyler. What you need is control. What you want is access. And what you're not going to get, ever again, is power over Mom's life. The table went quiet. And for the first time in that evening, I saw the balance shift. I wasn't the weak one anymore. I watched the tension crackle across the table like dry leaves in a fire pit. Tyler's eyes flicked to Ethan's face, gauging the strength of his brother's resistance. Mara shifted in her seat, the sharp confidence that usually clung to her like perfume starting to fade. The attorneys, who moments ago had looked like sharks, were now starting to glance around the restaurant, their polished bravado thinning. But I wasn't finished. With deliberate calm, I reached into my purse, past my checkbook, past the lip balm I always forgot I had, and pulled out the envelope. Not a fancy envelope. Not legal-sized. Just a plain manila one, slightly worn at the corners. I'd carried it with me every day for the past 2 weeks, waiting, watching, wondering if I'd ever need to set it on a table like this one. I placed it carefully in front of me. I believe I said softly, "You'll want to take a look at this before we go any further." Tyler frowned. "What is that?" Mara's voice cracked slightly. "Linda." I slid the envelope toward the middle of the table. "It's everything I didn't want to believe I'd need. But here we are." Ethan gave me a small nod. Not the kind of theatrical encouragement people offer in movies, but a real one. One that said, "I'm with you. Keep going." I looked at Tyler. "You remember the day you came to my house, said the wedding was going to be elegant. First class, you called it? You told me 75,000 was just a starting point, as if I were a bank instead of your mother." He didn't answer. I didn't say no that day, I continued. But I didn't say yes either. What I did say was that I needed time. You told me I was selfish, that I was choosing my comfort over your happiness. Tyler crossed his arms but didn't deny it. "Well," I said, folding my hands, "something in me shifted that day. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was something quieter, a hum under the skin, the kind of knowing a mother gets when she feels her child pulling away, not with sadness but with calculation." I looked at Mara. She was staring at the envelope as if it might explode. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Harold, your father, and what he'd say. I imagined him asking me, "Linda, do you trust them with everything we built?" And the answer, if I was honest, was no. I didn't. Not anymore. So the next day I made an appointment. Louise Farber's office was in a modest brick building between the post office and an old florist shop. She was 73, retired twice, and still sharper than anyone half her age. I'd met her once years ago when she gave a seminar at the community center about elder law. At the time, I'd taken notes politely, never thinking I'd need her. But that morning I called her office the moment it opened. She invited me in for tea, not coffee. "Coffee invites speed," she said. "Tea makes people think." I told her everything. About Tyler's demands, the tone he used, the cold way Mara looked at me when I suggested a simpler wedding. I even mentioned the way a neighbor said Tyler had asked whether I seemed forgetful lately. Louise didn't flinch. She listened, took notes with a fountain pen, and then told me exactly what to do. We created an irrevocable trust. All my assets. My home, the savings account I'd built penny by penny, Harold's life insurance. Even the stocks he left behind would go into that trust. Not just protected, but repurposed. The beneficiaries, my grandchildren. Both born and future. The trustee, Ethan. Because I knew where his loyalty lived, and it wasn't in a wedding tent filled with ego. Louise handled everything. Quietly. Efficiently. Discreetly. And while she did, I started documenting. I photographed the strange car that parked outside my duplex 3 times in 1 week. I called my friend Julia after she mentioned Tyler had stopped by to catch up and asked her if he'd asked about my health. He had. I pulled up security footage from my doorbell camera and saw Tyler taking pictures of the backyard, the shed, the air conditioning unit, the access panel to the crawl space. Things a son usually wouldn't care about, unless he was running a property valuation. All of it went into the envelope, and now that envelope was sitting on a linen-covered table at Franco's between the wine glasses and the forced smiles. I nudged it gently. "Go ahead," I said. "You'll want to see what's inside." Tyler didn't move. So Ethan picked it up, opened it, and began laying out the pages one by one. There were photographs, printed emails, time-stamped notes, a notarized letter from Louise confirming the establishment of the trust, a copy of the beneficiary structure, even a list of the questions Tyler had reportedly asked our mailman. Questions that made it clear he was trying to establish mental decline. As the papers spread across the table like a silent tide, Tyler's face turned gray. Mara's was already white as bone. "You've been planning this?" Tyler asked, voice thin. I tilted my head. "Not at first. But when you started planning around me, not with me, I had to make a choice." Ethan looked up from the documents. "You knew," he whispered. "All this time. You knew and you protected yourself." I nodded. "I did. And I protected your future children, too." One of the attorneys, Patrick, I think, began to gather his things. "Mrs. Carraway, I believe we may have misunderstood the nature of this dinner." "I believe you did," I replied evenly. He looked to Tyler, then to Mara, then stood. The others followed. I looked at Tyler one last time. "You brought contracts. I brought truth. That's the difference between what you planned and what I prepared." Mara finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You never trusted us." "No," I said quietly. "I stopped trusting who you became. They left. Without dessert. Without signatures. Without victory. And I stayed. Not to gloat, but to breathe. Because for the first time in a long time I could..." Just as the tension in the air reached its peak, when Tyler's mouth opened as if to hurl the next guilt-laced demand, the front door of Franco's swung open with a quiet authority that somehow silenced even the clink of wine glasses around us. Louise Farber walked in like she owned the truth. She wasn't tall. Her silver hair was pulled neatly into a twist at the nape of her neck. She wore a navy blazer over a pale cream blouse, sensible shoes, no jewelry except for a silver watch that had likely timed hundreds of depositions. But what made her imposing wasn't what she wore. It was how she looked at people. The kind of look that cut through performance charm and theatrics in under 3 seconds. Her eyes landed on our table and she walked straight toward us, briefcase in hand. "Mrs. Carraway," she said to me with a calm smile as if we were meeting for tea, "I trust everything is proceeding as you anticipated." "Perfectly on time," I said. She turned to the 3 attorneys seated across from me. "Gentlemen," she nodded. "Louise Farber, Estate and Protective Trust Law. I represent Mrs. Linda Carraway." One of the lawyers, the one who had handed me the original documents to sign, looked as if he'd swallowed a spoon sideways. I don't believe we've been introduced." "That's all right," Louise said smoothly, setting down her briefcase. "I didn't come to chat. I came to clarify a few things." She opened the case, pulled out a sleek leather folder, and slid it across the table. "This is a certified copy of the irrevocable trust my client established 2 weeks ago. Her home financial accounts and all relevant assets have been transferred into the Carraway Family Trust." Tyler blinked. "Wait, what?" Mara leaned in. "What does that mean?" "It means Louise said that your mother has already handled her affairs with full legal protection. She no longer owns the assets directly and therefore..." She paused to tap the leather folder gently with one manicured finger. "There's nothing here for you to sign, Mrs. Carraway." She looked directly at me. "That envelope you handed over a few minutes ago. It wasn't just documentation. It was strategy. A smart one." I gave a small nod of thanks. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady, whole. Tyler, however, was unraveling by the minute. He leaned forward. "Mom, we still need the money for the wedding. You can't be serious. Do you even realize what's at stake? Caterers, venue deposits. We're talking about real deadlines here." Louise didn't blink. "Your mother is well aware of the deadlines. That's why she acted before you could..." Tyler's face darkened. "So that's it. You'd rather watch your own son struggle than help him once in his life." I finally spoke slow and even. "You call it struggle, Tyler, but I call it manipulation. And it's not the first time you've tried it. This wasn't a conversation. It was a cornering. You didn't come to share your plans with me. You came to execute them with lawyers and veiled threats." His voice broke just a little. "And the baby. Mom, don't you want to be part of your grandchild's life?" I felt the familiar ache behind my ribs, the one that motherhood plants like a seed that never really dies. "I think about the baby every day," I said softly. "Probably more than you think about the woman carrying it." That landed. Mara flinched. Tyler looked away. Louise, ever composed, leaned back in her chair. Let me be perfectly clear. If any further attempts are made to pressure Mrs. Carraway into signing over rights assets or control of her estate, we will consider legal action for attempted financial coercion and elder abuse. The lawyers straightened uncomfortably in their seats. And just for the record, she added, we have call logs, video surveillance, neighborhood witness statements, and patterns of contact that demonstrate a sustained effort to question Mrs. Carraway's mental capacity without cause. You'd be surprised what counts as a threat when it comes from someone with power of influence. Tyler stood, knocking his chair back with a scrape. This is insane, he muttered. You'd do all this just to prove a point. I stood too slowly, not in anger, just to meet him at eye level. No, Tyler. I did all this to draw a line. I turned to Louise. Is there anything else? No, she said, rising with me. Unless Mr. Carraway or his fiancée would like to make further statements for the record. Neither of them spoke. I gathered my things. My phone, the envelope, now emptied my coat, and looked at the people who had once been my family but tonight had become something else entirely. From now on, I said clearly, I won't be signing anything outside the boundaries I set for myself. Not at this table. Not in this lifetime. Then I walked out of Franco's. Not in rage. Not in defeat, but in peace. The silence in my house felt different that night, not cold or accusing the way it had after Tyler's phone calls, not mournful like it used to be after Harold passed. This silence was softer. Not absence, but space. Not loneliness, but stillness. When I walked through the door, I didn't go straight to bed. I wandered from room to room like I was meeting them all again for the first time. The little hallway off the kitchen where Tyler used to leave his muddy cleats. The corner of the living room where we'd set up a tiny Christmas tree the year Harold was too sick to go out and get one. The faded place on the arm of the couch where Ethan used to rest his head during late-night study marathons. I sat down on the edge of my bed and stared at the burgundy dress still hanging on the back of the door. I hadn't even realized I'd left it there. It shimmered softly in the hallway light. That dress had seen so many milestones. Tyler's graduation, Ethan's med school dinner, Harold's retirement party, and tonight it had seen a mother draw her line. The tears came quietly, not sobs, not gasps, just a slow release from somewhere deep inside me. I cried for the baby I used to rock in my arms, who now saw me as an obstacle. I cried for all the birthday cakes and spelling tests and scraped knees and late-night talks that had somehow led to this moment. And I cried for the strange, aching relief that came from finally saying no. That's when I heard the soft sound of a key turning in the lock. Mom Ethan's voice floated in from the front door. "I'm here," I called out, wiping my cheeks with the sleeve of my cardigan. He walked in, still wearing his hospital scrubs, a takeout bag in one hand and a tired but gentle smile on his face. "I figured you hadn't eaten," he said, already unpacking the food on the kitchen counter. "Brought that pumpkin curry you like." We ate in silence for a few minutes, the good kind of silence. The kind that only comes when someone knows you well enough not to force words into the air. When he finally spoke, it wasn't with judgment. Just quiet honesty. "Mom, you weren't wrong to love him." I looked up, startled. "You loved Tyler the way only a mother can. Completely. But there's a difference between love and surrender, between forgiveness and submission." I didn't respond. I wasn't sure I could. He set down his fork and folded his hands. "You weren't wrong for loving him. But if you'd let that love keep you quiet tonight, if you'd signed that paper to stay in his life, you'd be letting love turn into self-erasure." His words settled on my heart like warm rain. That night, after Ethan had gone to sleep in the guest room, I stayed up folding blankets, wiping down counters, adjusting things that didn't need adjusting. I wasn't trying to clean. I was trying to remember who this home belonged to. Not just the people I'd loved in it, but the woman who'd built it. The next morning, I opened the closet in the hallway, the one I'd avoided for months. Inside were photo albums. Tyler's baby pictures, the boys on their first day of school, Harold grinning under the porch light with a cup of coffee. I sat on the floor and started sorting. Some photos I kept, carefully wrapped and boxed. Others I tucked into envelopes not to throw away but to release. There were memories that still belonged in my life and others that needed to live quietly in the past. I dusted off the small bookshelf by the window and placed just 3 frames there, one of Ethan in his white coat, one of Harold holding our first dog, and one of me taken on a solo trip to Maine just after the boys went to college. I'd almost forgotten that woman. She looked peaceful, capable. Later that week I was out watering the azaleas when I noticed a woman across the hedge bending to adjust a bird feeder. She wore a denim jacket, white sneakers, and had a head of soft gray curls pulled back with a simple clip. Her movements were precise, no-nonsense, almost military. We made eye contact and she offered a small nod. "You must be Linda," she said. "I'm Nora. Just moved into the blue house on the corner." I walked over, extending a hand. "Welcome to the neighborhood." She took my hand with a firm, dry grip. "Thanks. Downsized last month. Got tired of cleaning 5 bedrooms for ghosts." I smiled. I know the feeling. Over the next few days, Nora and I exchanged small talk while pulling weeds, collecting mail, or taking out the trash. She didn't pry, didn't ask questions with that subtle tone of curiosity people use when they've heard about family drama. One evening, she came by with a lemon pie and sat with me on the porch. "You ever feel like your life shrank while you were busy giving it away?" she asked suddenly. I turned to her. Every day. She nodded like that was the answer she'd expected. I was a nurse for 35 years, spent more time in hospital hallways than my own kitchen, raised 2 daughters, buried a husband, and forgot how to be still. Until I moved here. Her voice was even almost clinical. But her eyes were kind. She sipped her tea. "You look like someone who's remembering who she is." I didn't reply right away. Finally, I said, "I'm someone who said no for the first time. And I'm not sure what to do with the silence that followed." Nora gave a small laugh. "Then maybe you need new noise." She reached into her jacket and handed me a brochure, Senior Advocacy Network. I volunteer at the Community Resource Center downtown. We help folks who've been through things, especially financial abuse. Some just need help sorting their mail again. Some need to remember they're not crazy for setting boundaries. I turned the brochure over in my hands. It was simple, clean, a place for people like me. "I don't know if I'm ready to help anyone," I admitted. She stood to leave. "Then just come and listen. Sometimes that's enough." After she left, I sat on the porch long after the sun had dipped below the neighbor's fence. I listened to the crickets, the soft hum of someone's TV, the click of my wind chime. It wasn't peace yet, but it was the sound of space being cleared, for something new to grow. The first time I walked into the Elder Equity building, I almost turned around at the door. It was a modest place tucked between a pharmacy and a dog grooming salon, with a faded blue awning and a bell that jingled when you entered. Nothing about it looked revolutionary, but something about the air inside, the mix of peppermint oil and paper files of quiet voices and waiting coffee pots, told me this was a place where stories were finally allowed to breathe. Nora had driven us there. She parked her old Subaru with surgical precision and walked in like she'd done it 100 times before. I followed more slowly, clutching my tote bag like it was armor. There was a part of me, an old stubborn part, that still whispered, "You don't belong here. You handled it. You're strong." But I stayed. The intake coordinator, a kind woman named Darla with silver rings on every finger, explained the program. "We provide legal guidance for financial abuse," she said. "But just as important, we offer group counseling, validation, a place to tell the truth without shame." That word stuck in my throat, shame. Because as strong as I'd tried to be, there was still a part of me that felt embarrassed. Embarrassed that I had raised a son who'd see me as a source of wealth instead of wisdom. Embarrassed that I almost signed those papers, that I'd wanted to believe his dinner invitation was about love. The first meeting was quiet. 12 of us, most women, a few men. Some wore pearls and lipstick. Others wore old coats and looked like they hadn't spoken aloud in days. One woman, Joyce, talked about how her son had convinced her to co-sign a loan just for a short-term business idea. 2 years later, she'd lost her condo and was living in her sister's basement. Another woman, Darlene, told us her daughter had taken out 3 credit cards in her name, maxed them out, and left her to deal with the debt collectors. She said I owed her that much, for giving up her dreams to take care of her father when he got sick. Darlene whispered, but I never asked her to. And then there was Marianne. Soft-spoken, painfully neat. Her only child had moved her into a senior facility without consent, sold her house, and used the money to start a bakery. She sends cupcakes on Mother's Day, she said, eyes dry, but never comes to visit. By the end of that first session, I realized I hadn't said a word. But I had listened, deeply, and something inside me had shifted again, this time not in grief, but in solidarity. I wasn't alone. And I wasn't weak. I was part of a club no one wants to join, but one that held more strength in its silence than most people ever see. The third week, Darla asked if I'd consider sharing my story. I froze, not because I didn't want to, but because I wasn't sure if I could without breaking open again. But that night, I went home, brewed a cup of tea, and sat on the porch with a yellow legal pad. I wrote out every detail. Not for revenge, not even for closure, just for truth, for the sake of clarity, for the woman I used to be and the one I was trying to become. When the next meeting came, I brought my pages, and when I read them aloud, my voice only trembled once. I didn't cry, I didn't minimize. I said it like it happened to someone I still loved but no longer excused. My son tried to use my love as a tool, I said, and when I finally said no, he tried to twist that into cruelty. But boundaries are not betrayal, and choosing peace is not abandonment. When I finished, no one clapped. That wasn't the style here. But every head in the room nodded in unison, slow, respectful, like a silent oath, we see you now. Later that week, Ethan came by. He still looked tired. Emergency room schedules don't allow much rest. But his shoulders seemed lighter than usual. He brought groceries, some homemade chicken soup, and a plain white envelope. I thought you'd want to see this, he said, handing it to me. Inside was a black and white ultrasound printout, the small, bean-shaped outline, the beginnings of a face, a spine, a life not yet born but already waiting to be claimed. I stared at it for a long time. She's healthy, he said quietly. Heartbeat strong. No complications. I looked up. He hesitated. Mara didn't want me to tell you the gender. Said it should be a surprise. I placed the photo gently on the table and pressed my fingers against its edges. It felt so delicate, so unfinished, so far removed from the bitterness that surrounded her parents. I'm not angry, I said. At the baby, I mean. I know. She's innocent. He nodded. But the people around her, they'll have to make peace with their choices. He looked at me carefully. Are you saying you want to see her? I took a breath. I'm saying, when the time is right, and if the circumstances are safe and honest, then yes, I'd love to meet her. But not through guilt, not through manipulation, and never again under pressure. He reached across the table and placed his hand over mine. She'll be lucky to know you, on your terms. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked at the ultrasound again. So many beginnings in one small picture. So many lessons I'd already learned and so many more waiting to be rewritten. And somewhere deep in my chest, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Hope, not for what might be fixed, but for what might still grow. The message came through Ethan, not directly from Tyler, which told me all I needed to know. She was born last night, Ethan said, setting his coffee mug gently on the table. 7 pounds, 10 ounces. Dark hair. Big lungs, apparently. I nodded, still staring at the envelope in my lap. I'd been meaning to mail it for 3 days. They named her Adeline, he added, watching me closely. That was when I finally looked up. Adeline. My mother's name. I hadn't heard it aloud in years. She'd passed long before either of my boys had memories of her. A strong, quiet woman with a soft spot for honeysuckle and crossword puzzles. She used to tell me, draw the line early, Linda, or you'll spend your life being tripped over. Now here it was again. Her name. Given to a baby I hadn't been allowed to meet, spoken by a son who hadn't spoken to me since the night I walked out of Franco's. I didn't cry, but something inside me softened like the last patch of ice thawing in the shadow of spring. She's healthy, I asked. Ethan smiled. Strong as can be. And Mara recovering well? They're home already. I nodded again. There was a pause, long enough to let the next words feel rehearsed. Tyler asked me to tell you. He wants you to meet Adeline. I looked at him then, but Ethan continued, he said, only if you're open to revisiting the trust terms. I let the words settle. Not because I was shocked, but because I wasn't. I picked up the envelope in my lap and tapped it against my palm. I wrote him a letter, I said, and didn't know if I'd ever send it. Ethan didn't say anything, just waited. I pulled the flap open, unfolded the pages, and began to read aloud, more for myself than for anyone else. Dear Tyler, congratulations on the birth of your daughter. I hope she grows with the strength of her name and the softness of your father's smile. I was told you named her Adeline. That name means a great deal to me, and I hope one day you'll tell her about the woman she was named after. About how my mother taught me to love fiercely but never foolishly. Ethan told me you want me to meet her. I would like that too, but not at the cost you're suggesting. Let me be clear, I will not revisit the terms of the trust. Those decisions were made not out of anger, but out of self-respect. That trust protects my dignity, my stability, and my right to age without fear. You are welcome to bring Adeline to meet me. I ask that Ethan be present along with my attorney. I ask that finances not be mentioned in our conversation. I will hold her with love, not leverage. Tyler. I love that child. I loved her the moment I heard she existed. But I will not buy my place in her life with silence or surrender. I will not undo my boundaries to gain entry into a family that sees me as negotiable. You're her father. It's your job to choose the kind of legacy you want to build, but I will no longer twist myself to fit into someone else's blueprint. Should you wish to bring her under these terms, I welcome you. If not, I will grieve privately and live peacefully. With clarity. Mom. When I finished, Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said softly, That's more grace than I think he deserves. I folded the letter again, slid it into a fresh envelope, and sealed it. I'm not doing it for him, I said. I'm doing it for me. And maybe one day for her. I mailed it the next morning. The mailbox door clanged shut with a finality that surprised me. And then, nothing. No reply, no text, no knock on my door. Weeks passed. The weather cooled. The rosebush out front bloomed late, one last stubborn blossom clinging to its stem like a second chance. Some days I stared at the baby photo Ethan had printed from the hospital app. She looked nothing like me, not yet. But I imagined she might one day laugh like I did when I was a girl, or hate math, or love vanilla over chocolate. Other days I cleaned the house and didn't think of her at all. And that, I realized, was the truest shift of all. I wasn't waiting. I wasn't bargaining. I wasn't hurting. I had offered love without condition. I had extended an invitation without surrender. And whether it was accepted or not, my boundary stood, unmoved, unapologetic, unbreakable. It started with folding chairs in a drafty, multi-purpose room. Nora called it humble beginnings. I called it sacred ground. Every Tuesday at 4:12 p.m., we arranged the chairs in a circle. Not a row, not a lecture-style setup, but a circle. Because circles, as Nora liked to say, leave no one behind. We called it the Tuesday Circle. Not a formal support group, not a legal clinic, just a safe space for women who had at one point or another looked at someone they raised and realized, I don't recognize you anymore. Our first session had 7 women. Nora brought lemon tea in a thermos. I brought a stack of printed handouts titled, Understanding Financial Boundaries After Betrayal. Most women didn't read them. They just wanted to be heard. There was Deborah, who hadn't spoken to her eldest son since he borrowed her signature to take out a second mortgage on her home. She only found out when the foreclosure notice arrived. There was Jeanette, a retired school teacher whose daughter convinced her to hand over power of attorney temporarily after surgery and never gave it back. There was Ellen, a grandmother of 6 who had been living in her car until a friend discovered her situation. Her son had drained her savings under the guise of helping with investments. As the women took turns speaking, I noticed how often they began with apologies. I know I should have said no. I guess I was too trusting. I just didn't want to make them mad. It struck me how quickly we take the blame for someone else's cruelty, how naturally we shrink to accommodate their comfort even while we bleed. When it was my turn, I didn't read from a paper. I just spoke. I used to think setting boundaries meant shutting people out, I said. Like building a wall. Cold, harsh, punitive. But I've learned that boundaries aren't walls. They're doors. Firm doors with locks we choose. So we don't get swept away every time someone else feels entitled to walk in without knocking. There were nods around the circle. Not dramatic ones. Just quiet, heavy movements that said I've been there too. I told them about the dinner at Franco's, the envelope, the trust, the letter I mailed, and the silence that followed. But I didn't tell it like a tale of triumph. I told it like the truth, painful, complicated, and necessary. By the end of the hour, 2 women asked if they could bring friends next week. Bring a chair, Nora said. That's the only requirement. In the 3rd week, Ethan stopped by. He came straight from work, still in his scrubs hair, slightly damp from a quick rinse at the hospital. I hadn't asked him to come, but he said he was curious to see what his mother had created. The women welcomed him with warmth, a little teasing, and many questions. So you're the good son. What's it like seeing your mom run the show? He laughed and sat beside me. Honestly, it's like watching someone remember she can lift the world with her own 2 hands. That week we talked about guilt. Not the kind our children carried, but the kind they handed to us neatly folded in phrases like, you owe me, you're overreacting, don't you trust me? I shared one of the things my therapist from Elder Equity had told me. Guilt is not the same as grief. One you let go of, the other you carry differently. After the session, we lingered by the snack table. Someone had brought almond cookies. Another woman handed out little bookmarks with affirmations scribbled in pastel ink. One woman, Cheryl, who'd barely spoken all evening, turned to me as we stacked chairs. Can I ask you something? Of course. If your son came back, she said, and he said he was sorry, what would you do? I paused, not because I didn't know the answer, but because it deserved to be said with care. I wouldn't turn him away, I said, but I wouldn't rush to embrace him either. She tilted her head. I don't need an apology, I added. I need change. That's the thing they don't tell you about forgiveness. It's not about the words. It's about the pattern. You can forgive someone 100 times, but if they still treat you like a transaction, you're just giving them more rope to pull you under. As the women left that evening, I stood at the door offering hugs, nods, gentle squeezes on shoulders. Not everyone made eye contact. Some still held shame like a scarf they weren't ready to untie. But they came back the next week. And the next. The circle grew. One Tuesday, a woman brought her teenage granddaughter who had watched her grandmother's heartbreak unfold in court. Another week, a woman came just to sit in silence. She didn't speak, didn't move, but she stayed the whole hour. That was enough. That night, as I washed the mugs and wiped down the folding table, I realized something had shifted. I wasn't just healing. I was helping others see that their pain didn't make them weak. It made them worthy of protection, That their silence didn't mean consent. That their boundaries didn't mean they'd failed their children, but that they were still choosing themselves, perhaps for the first time in decades. And maybe, just maybe, that was where our real stories began. 6 months had passed since the letter. Spring had arrived like a sigh of relief. Soft, slow, and without asking permission. My garden was waking up again. Tulips I'd nearly given up on were pushing through the soil. The lavender, stubborn as ever, had started to bloom early this year, its scent lingering on my gloves long after I trimmed it back. I was kneeling by the raised bed, gently patting down a new patch of rosemary, when I heard footsteps behind me. I knocked. Ethan said, "But I figured the garden would answer faster than the door." I looked up and smiled. "You figured right." He handed me a paper cup of lemonade and crouched beside me. For a while, we just worked together in silence. That had become our rhythm. No small talk, no pressure, just hands in the dirt and peace between us. Then he cleared his throat. "I have news," he said, brushing a bit of soil off his pants. I waited. Tyler and Mara. They've separated. Officially. I didn't react. Not with surprise, not with bitterness. Just a slow nod. "She's staying in town," he added. "For now." I sat back on my heels and took a sip of the lemonade. "And the baby?" "She's with Mara. They're figuring things out." He hesitated again. Then Mara reached out to me. I looked at him. She said, "She'd like you to meet Adeline. No conditions, no agenda, just a visit." The breeze picked up slightly, carrying the scent of lavender and warm earth. I closed my eyes for a moment and breathed it in. When I asked, "Today, if you're up for it." I stood slowly, brushing off my knees. "I'll change." The hospital smelled the same as it always had. Antiseptic, linoleum, warm sheets, and distant beeping. It didn't scare me. I'd walked these halls before. When Harold was sick, when Ethan had finished his rotations, when I'd brought flowers to friends with new knees and new babies. But this time it felt different. This time I wasn't a caretaker. Or a patient. Or even a mother. I was a grandmother. And I was about to meet someone I'd loved before she even had a name. Mara was waiting just outside the pediatric observation room. Her hair was pulled back in a loose braid, no makeup, dark circles under her eyes. But her posture wasn't defensive. It was open, tired, real. We locked eyes. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. In that glance, I saw it all. The sleepless nights, the crumbling marriage, the weight of pride slowly giving way to clarity. And in return, I gave her something she probably didn't expect. Compassion. Not for what she did, but for what she had carried. She stepped aside, and I walked into the room. The bassinet sat near the window, bathed in soft afternoon light. There she was, Adeline. She was sleeping, cheeks full and pink, her tiny hands curled into gentle fists. I didn't move at first. I just stood and looked, not with hesitation but reverence, like I was seeing something holy. Mara spoke quietly behind me. "She's a good sleeper." I nodded. "She likes classical music," she added almost shyly. "And the sound of the dishwasher." I smiled. "She takes after me then." After a moment, Mara walked over and gently lifted Adeline, cradling her with a practiced grace that surprised me. "Would you like to hold her?" I nodded, and she placed the baby into my arms. Adeline stirred, then settled against my chest like she'd known the rhythm of my heart all along. I looked down at her face, at the small nose, the tiny chin, the barely there eyebrows. And something inside me, something quiet, but old, unfolded. I placed my hand gently over hers. So small, so trusting, so unaware of the wounds and wisdom that surrounded her. And I thought, this isn't a reunion. This is a beginning. Not a transaction. Not a reward. Not a truce. Just love. Simple. Undeniable. Unconditional. Mara didn't say anything about the trust. She didn't ask about money. She didn't press for anything. Instead, she watched me with eyes that shimmered. Not from tears, but from something else. A soft apology. Not in words, but in the way she looked at me holding her daughter. That was enough. When it was time to go, I handed Adeline back carefully. "Thank you," I said. Mara nodded. "She'll know who you are." As I walked out of the hospital, Ethan fell into step beside me. He didn't ask how it went. He didn't need to. We both knew. Back home, the sun was beginning to dip below the trees, casting golden light across the backyard. I walked to the garden, clipped a single sprig of lavender, and carried it into the house. There on the mantel was the old photo of Harold, the one where he's laughing with his eyes more than his mouth, holding a fishing rod and a soda in the same hand. I placed the lavender beside the frame, and I whispered more to myself than to him. You'd be proud. I didn't let them back me into a corner. I found my way out, and then I made space for something better. Then I turned off the lights, sat by the window, and watched the evening arrive without fear. Because this was peace. Not the kind I had begged for, but the kind I had built, with boundaries and grief and grace. Have you ever loved someone so deeply that you ignored every warning sign just to stay close? Have you ever been told you were selfish, just because you finally said no? If Linda's story touched something in you, maybe it's because you've felt that same pull, between love and self-respect, between silence and strength. We tell these stories not for revenge, but for restoration. To remind every woman listening that your boundaries are valid, your voice matters, and your worth isn't measured by what others take from you. If you've ever felt unseen, unheard, or replaced, you're not alone. So if this story resonated with you, leave a comment. Tell us what you would have done. Or what you did. We read every word.